We just about ready.
Alright, it's about as ready as I'm gonna get. That music. Monday, Monday, Monday. A new week, a new streak. Here we are, folks. Monday, Quarren stream.
checking out, making sure everything looks good. I think we're okay. How's it going? I am maybe slightly more well rested than I was last week. I'm getting this feedback. Let me turn this down. Oh, I forgot. I forget how to do this every time. Yeah, slightly got some sleep over the weekend. Feels good. Although I lost a little bit past night, but that's fine. Hope everyone's doing okay. Staying as safe as you can. Just thinking about when I prepare for these, I think it's always just going to be the case that if I'm going to do these kind of streams where I'm, trying to talk at length about some idea, trying to solidify my thoughts about something, that it's just like the Monday stream is just going to be, there's just always just all this information coming in, and I try not to bring things in that I just have nothing, I just can't say anything about, or I just have no reference for. I want to bring things in that are, sort of keeping up with the conversation, I guess, but not just like, hey, look at this thing, because I'm going through a list of things to talk about, reading some articles and things like that, and deciding what to bring up and what not to. There are things that are, compelling in some way, the whole, perhaps you've heard, it coming out, or not, I don't know how substantiated it is, but the claims that, Russia was essentially paying, they put a bounty out on, U.S. coalition forces in Afghanistan. And the claim that the Trump administration knew about it and didn't say anything and didn't do anything about it, and now the ensuing fallout from that, and obviously the denial from the White House and Trump. But that's an interesting thing, and I could talk about a little bit about sort of maybe the history of the Taliban, and about a little some the Mujahideen, and our own history in Afghanistan, between ourselves and the Soviet Union at the time. But that's like, if I have something I'm trying to talk about on a certain day, then maybe I'll save that. Or there are a lot of things where it's like, I could talk about things that are pretty compelling and would be good to know, but I just don't. If I don't have the depth to really offer anything about something, then for the most part, I'll just stay away, and maybe I'll just make a mention of it and say, you can look into it yourself, but I can't really speak on it too much. But anyway, all that is to say, we're back again on another stream, talking about some of the same stuff. There's a lot to. I kind of I want to expand on things, and expand on certain things that I mentioned, and make sure that I have something coherent to say about these different facets of the current paradigm, I guess. Because even with regards to the protests, recent protests, and Black Lives Matter, I think there's a lot to it. There's a reason it's ongoing. But anyway, I don't think I have much to announce beyond that for the start of the stream. So I'll get right into it. You guys might be proud to know that I finally I still do all my research and planning on my desktop, but now everything for the show, I make sure my notes are on my laptop so I can pull them up. And then once I go forward and do the article readings and stuff like that, I'll actually have them up, and then I'll be reading them, and then you guys will actually be able to see them. So we're getting a lot more advanced. But anyway, today's shout-outs and FUs. Number one shout-out off the top is a court order, a judge order that is essentially, it pertains to ICE detainment of minors, and sort of in relation to the basically threat, the danger of the pandemic. But why don't I read from this CBS News article, and I can pull it up for you guys. So, citing new coronavirus cases at detention facilities for migrant families, the federal judge overseeing litigation surrounding protections for undocumented minors in U.S. custody on Friday ordered Immigration and Customs Enforcement to release children the agency is holding with their parents or legal guardians. So this judge gave them a July 17th deadline, and this goes on to explain. G, who oversees, that's a great name, Dolly G, right? G, who oversees the government's compliance with the Flores Settlement Agreement, which governs the care of minors in U.S. immigration custody, cited the first coronavirus cases among the migrant families ICE holds at its 3 family residential centers, or FRCs. So it's important to note that this ruling is in compliance with that agreement, as it says in the article, meaning that the judge has purview over, their treatment of minors, but not necessarily of adults, i.e., their families and so on. So I want to continue. Continues about a statement. I think this article actually changed since I read it earlier today. Right. Essentially, while the judge cannot rule that they have to release the families of these children, they're being urged to, which is, worth what you can imagine how much that is worth. But it's certainly, it sets up the case for releasing these families, and especially on the grounds of the pandemic and the conditions at these facilities. So I mean, we've been very aware of the sort of horrific conditions at these detention centers, the separation of families, and the very brutal treatment of asylum seekers, especially now considering the pandemic. I know we're focusing on police brutality and sort of the police state out on the streets, but certainly the conversation around prisons and not just for cases of domestic criminal activity, but also obviously the detainment of migrants and the relationship between those two environments, and how the pandemic takes these very vulnerable people and puts them in even more of a life-threatening situation, and the neglect on the part of the government who is detaining these people to care for them when they are in their responsibility. So this ruling, we'll see exactly how it plays out. It says these kids are to be released to their legal guardians, parents, or other family. So I don't know what it means if their only family that they have in the country is, also detained. But hopefully it allows in the future to for the release of these people, release of these families, and a real deep look into the conditions at these facilities. But I mean, again, they have about they have like half a month ICE to comply, or else give a reason why they don't after July 17th. So we have some time to see how it's going to shake out. Obviously, ICE is planning to fight the ruling, but this is some reason for optimism. So shouts out to that. And another shout out involves a court ruling. Here we have, where is it? Right. Okay. Yeah. So essentially, in many states, continued fight against reproductive rights. There was a Louisiana law. Why don't I just read here from the Daily Beast on this Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court has struck down a Louisiana abortion law. Hold on, let me switch so you guys can see it. The Supreme Court has struck down a Louisiana abortion law that opponents say would have closed all but one abortion clinic in the state and had lasting repercussions for reproductive rights across the country. The Louisiana law, known as Act 620, would have required abortion providers to have the ability to admit patients at local hospitals. Supporters said the legislation promoted safety and continuity of care. Abortion rights advocates say it was a medically unnecessary restriction, which would force abortion clinics to shutter because many abortion providers have been denied such privileges. Article goes on to continues. Admitting privileges or a physician's authorization to admit and treat patients at a hospital are notoriously difficult for abortion providers to secure, both because of the controversy around the procedure and because it rarely requires hospital admission. In Louisiana, a district court found that 4 of 6 providers in the state would not be able to obtain such privileges, and a 5th would be restricted to practicing at only 2 locations. As a result, the court found 2 of the state's 3 remaining clinics would shutter. The Louisiana law is nearly identical to a law passed in Texas in 2013 that forced more than half of the state's abortion clinics to close. Studies showed abortion seekers in the state were forced to drive farther, spend more money, and wait longer for their abortions in the months that followed. A Supreme Court ruling declared that law unconstitutional in 2014, saying it placed an undue burden on people seeking abortions, but many of the shuttered abortion clinics never reopened their doors. So, I mean, it's a good situation that law was struck down, but obviously, there was precedent, and it still had to be fought. And even with that original Texas ruling, the damage was done to reproductive rights in that state, and this is something that definitely, one of the things that I think we kind of noticed, or I noticed, in sort of the early stages of the Trump administration, where there's all this sort of discordance and difficulty keeping up with the narrative, and then there were all these really quiet, insidious activities that lawmakers, state-level lawmakers, would putting forth, and a lot of it had to do with reproductive rights in these red states, and it's something you can't sleep on these motherfuckers, because they're going to continue to try this stuff. But legal precedent does continue to build strength. So I mean, man, 3 clinics in an entire state, that is rough. And they were going to try and they want to continue to try and make it difficult for people to have access to this kind of care. So I mean, great that this ruling was called this way, but certainly the fact that it would have taken it from 3 clinics down to 1. I mean, it sort of speaks to the condition of people's rights in these states. So always, yes, something to keep an eye on. Moving on to the fuck yous. So we have some fun stuff. Again, to do with the administration. As we know, if you've been following the elections this past couple of months during the pandemic, there's been a lot of calls for how to make these elections safer, because in a lot of these situations you're seeing people waiting in line at these voting centers for hours in close proximity, putting themselves and volunteers in, mortal danger. And the calls for making it easier to do things like vote by mail, which seems like a very uncontroversial thing, has become very controversial and has been sort of, a battleground for the administration, the White House. And we see that continue to play out. Here from the Philadelphia Inquirer. The Trump re-election campaign sued Pennsylvania state and county elections officials Monday, saying mail ballot drop boxes were unconstitutional in the way they were used in the June 2nd primary election, and asking a federal court to bar them in November. Quote, defendants have sacrificed the sanctity of in-person voting at the altar of unmonitored mail-in voting and have exponentially enhanced the threat that fraudulent or otherwise ineligible ballots will be cast and counted in the forthcoming general election, end quote, says the suit, filed in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania. The article continues, instances of voter fraud are rare, and there's virtually no evidence of successful widespread conspiracy to commit fraud via mail ballots. Parentheticals, an alleged effort in Paterson, New Jersey last month quickly raised flags, and last week the state attorney general charged 4 men in the scheme. And it kind of continues some of the reasoning and the logic and things like that. Certainly, due to the pandemic, and the nature of sort of, we kind of saw in the primaries of the difficulty with integrating new systems when it comes to voting, whether that be by incompetence or foul play. In Iowa, the whole, the company that was handling the was it the tabbing or the communication of the caucus results. Some of the people in that company had ties to the Buttigieg campaign, and it was very sus. And now, as governments are tackling the issue of voting safely, if they're indeed even actually worried about that, quickly pivoting to mail-in voting, which, it's a logistical undertaking, but to attack it on these grounds, obviously because it makes it easier for people to vote. And, if your numbers are down, maybe you don't want people to vote. Obviously very cynical. Hopefully that, they lose. I don't know how much of a leg they have to stand on. Because, as the article states, usually voter fraud is really not as big of a deal as, say, voter suppression, which is well documented and certainly, especially, exacerbated during a pandemic when it's literally dangerous for people to go out and exercise their constitutional right to vote. But yeah, this doesn't help. So be aware of the diminishing of freedoms, and don't buy that bullshit. So fuck you to the Trump re-election campaign for that. And our other fuck you for today, from The Intercept, FBI expands ability to collect cell phone location data, monitor social media, recent contracts show. So, this Intercept article just sort of highlights a couple of renewed contracts with a couple of companies that the FBI may be using to surveil protesters, because we know that certain apparati of the state have been doing that. So from the article, on May 26th, as demonstrations around the country erupted over the police killing of George Floyd, the FBI signed an expedited agreement to extend its relationship with Dataminr, a company that monitors social media. A few days later, the agency modified an agreement it signed in February with Ventel Incorporated, a Virginia technology firm that maps and sells the movements of millions of Americans. The company purchases bulk location data and sells it largely to government agencies. And the article continues some of the implications of this. I was doing a lot of reading before getting the stream ready, so I haven't prepped the articles as well as I might have in the past few weeks, just because there's a lot of information I've been keeping track of. Right, article from the article. Few regulations exist to restrict the use of location tracking data, a form of data collection that many common phone applications collect and monetize. The Supreme Court's 2018 Carpenter versus the United States ruled that government prosecutors require a warrant to obtain cell phone location data from service providers. But many experts worry that the ruling may not apply to third-party data brokers such as Ventel. So essentially, if you can look into the article, the FBI is sort of quietly, renewing its private contracts with companies that keep track of your data through various means. At some point, I was thinking about this, considering doing a stream on, surveillance, the surveillance state, the issues of security in the modern day, and the trading of certain freedoms for the trading of certain freedoms and protections and issues of private information for a sense of security, and the implications of that and the dangers of that. Although I don't know if I could really speak substantively about something like that for a long period of time. It would certainly take a lot of research if I was to suddenly try to become an expert on that and speak about that fluently. But that is something to highlight and something to worry about. And it's going to kind of go hand in hand with some of what I want to talk about for today's main topic. But those are my shout outs and my fuck yous. It can be kind of bleak sometimes, but we got to take the ups and the downs, the wins and the losses, and I just kind of understand what the field is that we're playing, and just kind of keep your eye on the prize, really. But before I begin with the topic of the day, I do want to highlight, and I have it linked in the description on the YouTube video, but there is a report on Sludge, a statistical report about cities spending on police. And the basic finding is that on average, cities spend about a third of their general fund on policing, and that cities with poor citizens tend to spend more of the budget, and they also sort of debunk the correlation between city spending on policing and the level of crime. There isn't a strong correlation between more cops, more spending on cops equals less crime. But there is a correlation between, if the constituents of the city are poor, largely across the board, then that city is going to tend to spend more on police. And they put a correlation in sort of like data points and things like that. It's pretty technical article. There is some parts of it where it kind of like summarizes some of the findings. But maybe if you're a statistics nerd, you can trawl through that. And if I see something that breaks it down in a more simple way, I might share that. But this is definitely a good one to look into, especially if you're having conversations with people about the whole defund police argument, and how it's very much grounded in a lot of really good information and data. But yeah, I recommend looking into that and trying to make some sense of that yourself. And I'll try to find ways to sort of make it some of the deeper stats a little more palatable. But those big findings regarding the amount that cities tend to spend on their policing, how it usually is the highest, the highest spending item on a city budget, and how it doesn't necessarily correlate that if you spend more on cops, you have less crime. And certainly we've seen correlations in the past where it tends to be if you have less cops, there's less crime. Usually because, these cities have other, it's not just policing that makes a safe, happy city. It's these other social goods, housing, education, and so on and so forth. And that is the main argument of defund the police, where we're spending our money in the wrong place if we want to look at helping our communities, maintaining peace, and maintaining low crime rates, and increasing a general quality of the life of people in a city. Take that money from police spending and put it elsewhere in your budget, things that are more beneficial, universal programs, things that address poverty and the issues of poverty. But again, that's a good article to look into. I recommend it. It's a bit of a read. All right. So what are we talking about today? Kind of a lot. I've been thinking about a way to sort of put it into a concise thesis. Kind of has to do with some of the things I've been speaking about regarding the current discussion around police brutality and the sort of like, I don't know. I mentioned the Cedric Johnson article last week in Jacobin about the sort of blackwashing of the Black Lives Matter movement. How we're getting a lot of these pretty asinine concessions from brands and companies and politicians, stuff that nobody asked for. Like I saw a joke, I forget who it was, where McDonald's announcing that they're deposing Mayor McCheese and the Hamburglar will take over and he's black or something like that. Some stupid stuff like that. Really, really superficial things. And I tried to make the distinction between substantive change, things that really address our relationship to power, things that have an effect over, the environments and the institutions that surround us and sort of run our lives, versus the sort of very easy cultural and just sort of lip servicey kind of stuff that we've been seeing a lot of. And I've also sort of been critical of, the sort of habitual reflexive need to, the way to exercise your power, your people power, is not for a collective action, whether it be like a strike or a boycott or something along those lines that affect the economic sector, but, just trying to call people out on social media and getting people to stop interacting with certain people. And interacting and trying to do activism in a way that is just sort of, it's very it doesn't challenge our role as consumer subjects. We can do it while interfacing with the world in the way that, corporations, capital wants us to. You go on social media and you post and you call people out. And you may be able to do damage to people who have power, but you have not done anything to address that hierarchy that gave them the power. So in that way, maybe you can threaten a CEO who did blackface a couple times, and have them have to step down and take a lower position or something like that somewhere else once the heat is off of them. But they're just that vacuum is just going to be filled by another CEO. So I was talking about the limits of that kind of action and how it's sort of a trap for people to put all their energy into that versus other means. And so today I want to focus more so on how do we distinguish the people, the opportunists, the grifters, the people who just try to pacify movements and pacify people, who try to co-opt messages and movements for whatever their own political gains are. How do we separate those people from our the ones who are truly on our team and the comrades? And I guess the degree to which we have to do that, and I certainly think it is pretty essential to sort of understand who's helping you, who isn't, what's working and what isn't, while at the same time avoiding just sort of a purity contest and trying not to trying to build a better movement versus trying to build a perfect movement. Because building a better movement in a way that strengthens us and gives us momentum and gives us longevity and actually helps us make some ground against entrenched power, versus building a perfect movement which just kind of involves expelling anyone other than yourself, and just sort of increasingly individualizing these things which we need mass movements for, and focusing too much on individual purity as sort of the goal, as sort of what we put most of our energy into. And I guess I do want to start with pointing out where keeping your head on a swivel is important. And I want to bring in a personal anecdote. So in my house, in the living room, the TV is on, most of the day. And about half of the day, what's being played is Chinese historical fiction dramas about kings and concubines and princes and people going behind each other's backs and killing each other and poisoning each other and stuff, and fun stuff like that. And the other half is local news. And there is something very almost insidious and deeply troubling about the way certain things are covered. And even then we have to have a certain amount of nuance, but I'll get to that. So often, you get to see it if you watch local news or mainstream like cable news. The way things are covered are very different than if you go through, you're reading a few different articles, or you're seeing somebody's takes on it on Twitter, or you're reading more, specific, leftist or progressive outlets. The very common trends that you'll see is that whenever, you probably have seen this being called out, that whenever something happens involving the cops, it's always an officer-involved shooting. There's very little active voice. There's very little attribution of consequence when it comes to the cops. It's never like the cops beat this guy and then he was paralyzed. It's like, in a police-involved altercation, this suspect received injuries that led to life-changing consequences, or whatever. And you're just kind of expected to read between the lines. And I understand to a degree, there's a certain amount of culpability in which we have to, there has to be some sort of legal ruling before something can be declared one way or the other. So it has to be this sort of very neutralized language that doesn't implicate anybody. But oftentimes the benefit of the doubt and the favor in those neutral calls benefit law enforcement and the state to the detriment of their victims. So I'll sit here, my room is hot, I have the door open, I hear the news coming in, and it's always like, oh man, all this property damage because of protesters and these injuries. And I hear very little. If you're even just a little bit aware of the protests that have been going on the past month, you'll be aware of countless, just mind-blowing amounts of police violence in response to constitutionally protected action, where people are peacefully gathering. It doesn't even matter if they're peacefully gathering, whatever they're doing, the level of backlash by law enforcement is heinous, to say the least, and well documented for a fact. The beating, the rushing, the tear gassing, rubber bullets, the injuries and death to protesters, bystanders, and journalists alike. Well documented, many cases, and oftentimes very, very, very downplayed in these discussions. And it seems very sinister, and it's hard to say because, if you're really plugged in, you may know, oh, this or so journalist or pundit, they have this relationship with these people, or this news organization is funded by this billionaire who has this agenda, they donate to these causes. And if you look into these things, you'll often find, a deep web of associations that make you question how and why things are covered in the news. And I know it's sort of a dangerous, we live in a strange and confusing and dangerous time where, the state calling out journalists and sort of painting a target on journalists' backs. But the reason that those claims carry water is because there is a sort of deep distrust in our news media, because we understand, we can see these biases and we can see the danger of them, and we understand that the full story is not always told. Somebody makes a decision for how to tell you the story and how much information to give you. Because if you read an article that doesn't just show two sides, it shows multiple sides on a situation, which there often are, you're going to see 7 contradictory statements. and you're gonna walk away going like, well, I don't know what the fuck to think about this. So you really have to look into it deeper, or you have to have some background knowledge on the subject ahead of time to really even make sense of it. But that's generally how things are. There's going to be a lot of different interests surrounding different topics and different events, and this sort of neutralizing two sidesism that is played up in news media is just sort of, it dulls all the nuance, and it flattens the level of basically truth of the matter, because in a situation that literally involves just two sides, if one side says one thing and one side says the other, and they completely contradict each other, is the truth somewhere in the middle? I mean, that's the common wisdom, but it could just be that there is something that actually physically happened, and it is in one party's interests to claim it happened one way versus the other. And we know that the cops lie a lot. They lie about what happens to people in their, detained by them. We know they lie about when they go out and order from fast food places. They plant evidence, and it is generally, common journalistic practice to sort of just take their word for it. And that's very dangerous. And we see many examples of how that plays out to the direct detriment of people's lives. So I do want to, speaking of, being cautious of and really critical about, where you get information of. So the Daily Beast had a fairly substantial article about CNN's Van Jones and his relationship to Jared Kushner and the Trump administration, and his sort of hand in the sort of impotent executive order from the administration regarding, police reform. And it's something where I could spend like a long time just going, line by line and talking about, but I don't have necessarily a lot of background on Van Jones himself, or a lot of the players, the movers and shakers. But I do recommend looking into that. CNN's Van Jones reported in the Daily Beast his relationship with the administration. And I think it highlights the need for people to understand, looking into others' associations, and it kind of goes in, some of the defense is like, he's just playing on the inside, trying to get, if some person is in power, there might be, the obvious tactic, if you oppose, their whole agenda, is to oppose them as an outside force. But many say a legitimate tactic is to try to get close to that power and try to influence in some way to make whatever small victories that you can make. And I can certainly see the logic in that, but that sort of like, subterfuge tactic could also very easily have the effect of hamstringing the momentum for a movement. As we've seen with this whole conversation about police brutality, sound of the police, speaking of, as I mentioned, it's very easily co-opted by these more centrist groups calling for much lighter reform, and it's much easier for governments to enact those kinds of reform that don't really involve much structural change when it comes to the institution of policing. And then they can turn around and say, well, we did it. We did what you wanted. The cops, we told them that it's bad to do blackface and say the N-word, and we spent $100 million doing it, and now cops are good, so you don't have to worry about it. I mean, it's very easy for these kind of things to take fuel from the fire of a movement and to sort of, as I said, kneecap it. So, we should be exploring as many different tactics as are viable, but we have to really be careful about, letting certain people decide that they're going to be the leaders of, how we're going to move forward into a better world. Even in this instance, on the subject of policing and police reform, and be wary of people who are in positions to take momentum away from actual movements, like grassroots, ground level movements, which is where the majority of our energy needs to be. Again, there are other tactics. We have electoral politics, which, again, I'm not going to completely discount. And certainly there are victories on that level in terms of those kind of politics. But we have to understand what the base needs to be. So, yeah, I want to start with that there are, in fact, maybe not bad actors. Not everyone is necessarily have to be a bad actor to maybe not doing the most helpful thing. And it's easy to say that someone who accomplishes any little thing, if someone works close with Trump administration, like Kanye or something, and they get someone out of jail who shouldn't have been in jail, and I, who just talk and, talk about what we should be doing, haven't done anything for anybody, there's an argument where you can say, well, that's been more effective than anything I have done, which may be true in terms of the results of individual action. But again, I always want to stress that the individual isn't important on like a, physical or spiritual sense, metaphysical sense, the value of the individual and the value of life. But the individual as an agent of change is something we have to be critical of, because that is something that is in line with sort of the philosophy of our economic system, how it the philosophy of capital and how it plays out. So it is important to sort of be wary and be critical, and to understand and try to understand people's associations, and try to understand, what it is, where they're coming from, what are their class interests. A lot of media people and pundits have a vested interest in the system as it is. It pays them a lot. It gives them a career. The people that, people that they interact with for their work, the people that they report on, their sources and stuff like that, are very close to the system as it is. And it's important to recognize those associations and how it might, poison the balanced reporting on various things. But what the issue becomes with that instinct is that, particularly online, right? We get into this issue of individualized purity politics, and you hear that word a lot on the right, purity politics. But it is an issue, a genuine issue, that also has the negative effect of hamstringing a movement due to infighting and this sort of moralizing on things that are less relevant to, a class struggle. I've been reading a little bit of Lorenzo Gamboa Ervin, some of his writing about Black Anarchy, and his article, Kill the Cop in Your Head, who's sort of calling out, different sects of the left. And, I know he has his own views, and, it's kind of funny when there's these different groups amongst the left sort of calling each other out for just sort of being their ideas being totally hypothetical and just sort of being detached from reality, where that can kind of be said of everybody who isn't like creating movements on the ground. And even if you are, there may be limits based on your approach, which I might touch on. There's a bunch of things that I'm juggling, but so I've been reading that, and I've also been reading a little bit of Mark Fisher, his Vampire Castle analogy, which speaks specifically to sort of the what we might now call cancel culture and sort of the shortcomings of that. And actually, I might want to read specifically from that essay. He kind of talks about this specific example of Russell Brand and like sort of the instinct to, if someone doesn't fit the right bill, doesn't use the right language, which there is a power to language, but there is this very like, perhaps it speaks to sort of the lack of true institutional power on the left outside of academia, which even then there's not really like power. It's just the fact that a lot of people who are part of leftist movements, in the 20th century, they all became professors, and that's sort of where the dominion of leftist thinking retreated after, the deep state, dismantled, civil rights organizations and, labor, militant labor activists and communists and so on and so forth, who were fighting for like deep structural change, jailed, killed, etc. Those people bottom out. And so, a lot of these things, have fled to just the intellectual space, academia, and now to like online. And, this sort of feeds into the feeling that, where we have our control is simply in the language of thought, and the language, or simply in the field of thought and the field of language. As the only place where we have any kind of actual power to assert this or that. So people are very focused on the language that everyone else uses and the sort of speaking about hypotheticals, like whoever has the best hypothetical ideals, whether or not they actually play out in reality. And I'm certainly a proponent, like, if you are middle class, you have the time and access to educate yourself on various issues of marginalized groups, you should be doing that. You don't really have an excuse to not understand if you are trying to move through these spaces and want to consider yourself progressive in any way, whether or not you are. I mean, I think everyone absolutely should if they have the time and the means. But sort of trading that knowledge and the enforcement of these new understandings, trading that for an actual engagement in organizing and building power for a leftist cause, an anti-capitalist cause. And so in the Exiting the Vampire Castle essay from 2013, he kind of touches on some of those patterns on these online spaces and its different characteristics, and how it sort of gets away from the class-based analysis that is sort of necessary for the general leftist project. And he sort of talks about how I can explore this, but at least for the conceit of the essay, he talks about how identities as we understand them, marginalized identities, you have terms like people of color and things like that. These are sort of academic descriptions that recognize the sort of like the historical context of these social constructs of race and gender and sexuality, and recognizing how these different aspects of a person have historically affected the way they go about the world. But in the essay, he warns against essentializing, and I would stress the same thing. Like, yes, if you are black, you may go about the world. The world may see you in a certain way and may treat you in a certain way. But that doesn't mean, we can't presuppose 10 different things about a person just because they're black or because they're a white woman or something like that. We can understand things about a person's history based on their race, or the history of a person's race, and perhaps if we know more about their family history and things like that, we can understand sort of the context with which they go about the world, because we understand the context of the world that they live in. But essentializing people based on their identity, if you are this or that, then you must be this or that, we must treat you this or that way, is counterproductive. And sort of this focusing on dividing people up by their identities, not to address the specific issues of specific communities, but in this just sort of academic way, and trying to use that as a sort of activism. It plays out in these unhelpful ways that I've been talking about. But I want to read a couple of these paragraphs. Talks about they must reject identitarianism, which is basically kind of what I explained, about the sort of breaking up of different groups and sort of essentializing them. But the rejection of identitarianism can only be achieved. Let me cue it up so you guys can actually see it. But the rejection of identitarianism can only be achieved by the reassertion of class. A left that does not have class at its core can only be a liberal pressure group. Class consciousness is always double. It involves a simultaneous knowledge of the way in which class frames and shapes all experience, and a knowledge of the particular position that we occupy in the class structure. It must be remembered that the aim of our struggle is not recognition by the bourgeoisie, nor even the destruction of the bourgeoisie itself. It is the class structure, a structure that wounds everyone, even those who materially profit from it, that must be destroyed. The interests of the working class are the interests of all. The interests of the bourgeoisie are the interests of capital, which are the interests of no one. Our struggle must be towards the construction of a new and surprising world, not the preservation of identities shaped and distorted by capital. If this seems like a forbidding and daunting task, it is. But we can start to engage in many prefigurative activities right now. And he kind of just goes on. And sort of speaks to some of the things that I've been trying to set up. Essentially, we got to play our own game. I speak about the importance of education and understanding, and it is very important. It's very important to understand your history and the context of the world you're living in, and the systems and the structures that govern the way you live your life and your opportunities, and your futures. But understanding, like, if you take that knowledge to go back and just sort of, wage a battle on their terms and try to play their game and just try to do everything, through social media and through call outs and things like that. Some of these things have their place, and I think there needs to be a space for movements to be self-critical, but we have to be self-critical and self-analyzing without being self-destructive. Just like an individual, a person can be like, yeah, I have these personal faults, kind of an asshole, kind of not pleasant to be around, and I hurt people around me. So they have the analysis, right? And then their prescription for that analysis is, well, maybe I suck, so I just have to destroy myself with drugs and other excessive drug use and other behaviors that hurt me, so that I don't hurt anyone else by destroying myself. Like, maybe maybe at the end of the day you'll accomplish, you'll address the issues that you saw when you did that analysis portion, but that's not very helpful to anybody. If there are toxic elements of a movement, and if there are areas that we need to grow, then there should be a certain amount of leeway to address those and a certain amount of benefit of the doubt. And the difficulty with that is that because of, how separated and atomized we all are, and how many people out there are genuinely acting in bad faith, there's this sort of cynical sense that, if someone is stepping out of line, then they were bad all along, they were wrong all along. There needs to be some room for people to grow. And it seems to me the way to allow people who are not pure and perfect into a movement without sort of poisoning the movement itself is to, one, have healthy structures of accountability, so that, oftentimes when we see abuse, it's abuse that is propped up by hierarchy. People in positions where they have some power over others, and they can exert that power in an abusive way. So having accountability where there are hierarchies, so that people don't have that kind of influence and that kind of power. And also centering movements around people who traditionally are marginalized in society. So, I mean, like, Irvin's take is like, they need to build a specifically black anarchy, black communities, and a sort of like black syndicalist, not quite state. Which, there's a lot to there may be a lot to glean from those propositions and some of that analysis. But if we're concerned about a unified class-based movement of, the people versus capital, as it is, there ought to be a centering of needs of these, historically marginalized communities, but also an understanding that goes beyond essentializing people from these communities. Because again, you could be black and be a billionaire. You could be a gay billionaire. There's all kinds of billionaires. I talked about that, the Rainbow Coalition of Billionaires. It doesn't change necessarily the life experience of, poor working class people from those communities. But it also speaks to the fact that no group is a monolith. And we have to recognize that. But there just needs to be a sort of general understanding, and it's difficult because historically, progressive leftist movements, the past half a century basically, have really had very little power, very little influence. We've made some cultural strides in terms of a sort of social liberalism regarding, people's sexuality and their skin color and things of that nature. And there have been like actual, legal victories for those groups. Just because a group is not experiencing the same level of like sort of social or harassment and oppression under the law, at least as it is penned, doesn't mean we've changed the power structure, and doesn't mean we've leveled out the hierarchies that exist in our society, which should be our ultimate goal. So sort of, I guess the prescription is threefold. Yes, be critical of things that could harm the movement and people who are maybe not acting in good faith, particularly when those people, they have moneyed interests, who's paying them and things like that. Try and build something that allows people to grow and allows people to come in who are maybe not 100% on board with whatever it is, everything that you're saying, but for the most part, they're sympathetic to your general project, and from there, you can build an understanding and do the education part, which is sort of the most important part, is to have the fundamental goal and have everything be guided by that fundamental goal, which is the sort of liberation of people from our economic system and sort of the democratization of all avenues of our lives. As we understand it, the financial world and our lives as workers is very undemocratic. We have very little say over the workplace, and when it comes to issues of finance and issues of the economy, those are the kind of things that really have the most effect on our lives. So if we are concerned with people being as free as possible, and society being as democratic as possible. That is what we ought to be concerned with, and that is what our goal ought to be. And then we could decide how we do that and the scope of that. Personally, I think we can get into it, but, yes, the U.S. has a large impact on, all manner of things globally. And so changing the priorities and the way the U.S. works would have sort of foreign policy implications. But we have to understand, we have to see things globally, just partially, from a moral sense, yes, because we need to have a sense of connection with all people, but also from a strategic sense, because, just because we can only fight, the forces of capital from in our backyards, as just people in the world, capital moves all over the world. Companies have affiliates here, all across the globe. And their influence spans, the entire global, economic system. Look at the World Bank and the IMF. We could spend some time talking about that and how, world finance has sort of had a direct hand in, snuffing out genuine change in a lot of different countries. Talk about post-colonial Africa, post-colonial Haiti, all throughout South America, which I mentioned a little bit on these streams. So yeah, it's important to have a large spanning perspective, because if you can identify what you're working against, you're going to eventually run into the fact that they don't just operate in one country. All different time zones. So we have those three points. And I do want to talk about something a little more specific, which I totally forgot to mention because my notes are very unorganized. But I have the whole Antifa thing in the on the thumbnail, at least on YouTube. Let me take a peek. Nobody's on Twitch, or at least nobody's talking on Twitch. So I do want to mention a sort of shout out to a channel on YouTube, Bad Empanada. Did a recent video about a certain figurehead, not really figurehead, just like a sketchy ass person, and in the context of the coup in Bolivia last year, and sort of, one thing I did want to speak about when I was talking about like shady characters and grifters and opportunists is NGOs and nonprofits. We think of these things as neutral and for the forces of good and things like that, but a lot of people who run these things make a lot of money and they make a lot of connections. Whether they're human rights or activist groups. Again, that video from Bad Empanada just kind of details this person's human rights organization and like their ties to the coup government and their total uncritical relationship to it. But it made me think of, because I looked up Antifa, so I just get a thumbnail for the video, and the first result was from the ADL, which has is very friendly to the Israeli government, would be hesitant to they're supposedly like a human rights group, but these different groups, they have their biases and they have their own affiliations, which you always have to be aware of. And I just thought their description of Antifa was funny because it's like, yeah, their historical background of Antifa is from anti-fascist action in the early 20th century, which saw the rise of some very successful fascist states, and sort of the ideas, particularly anarchic ideas, of combating fascism directly, and then sort of goes on to say about how they're bad, basically. And I want the other thing that I want that, I mean, it's kind of related to what I was talking about, but more specifically, what I want, or what I think people should be aware of, is basically being mini police. I talked about the FBI earlier, and how they're basically they're keeping an eye on protesters. Protesters have been arrested a few hours after going to a protest, even though their face was covered up and things like that. On the dangers of posting people's any identifying features when they're at these protests, even though they're perfectly legal, most of the time. People assembling, they have the right to assemble, and still getting arrested and still getting beaten on and tear gas and stuff like that. But I feel like there's just been this tendency of people to if the FBI is going after someone we don't like, that's good, which maybe, or if Twitter bans someone we don't like, that's good. But I'm wary of relying on the deep state and big tech to sort of keep us safe and keep the streets clean and things like that. I mean, I'm not saying that certain bad actors and certain dangerous individuals being like deplatformed or whatever, or detained, like if someone planned to do some sort of like violent hate crime and they were stopped by the FBI, I can't say that's a bad thing. But them using any excuse that they can get to justify increased surveillance on people, that's something to be very wary of. And people playing mini cops by trying to call out, there was that video of somebody calling people out. There are these white Antifa type people, like, you better not throw a brick, you better go vote, or whatever. I mean, there's something to be said, like, about property destruction and the impact that it might have on a community. But people literally like trying to hand over people to the cops because they don't like how they're protesting or whatever. That's dangerous. People working with cops, people playing nice with law enforcement and lawmakers and trying to sell things that satisfy all those groups and saying, look, we're reforming, we're making things better. That is, that is also dangerous. It also has the same danger of hamstringing the movement and taking energy from it. So I mean, yeah, there's a lot of pitfalls to keep track of, and it's certainly exhausting. And I see what people get on the defensive, and I mean, I get that feeling. You see something like so and so did something terrible, so fuck them or whatever. But depending on the situation, it's like most of the time it's like, well, I didn't even know who this person was anyway. But I do think, I mentioned on here before that we have to be wary of, especially in the context specifically of these protests, the narrative between peaceful, nonviolent protesters and violent, illegitimate rioters and looters and opportunists. And how that is a very, very specific narrative. Speaking of being wary of news media, there's a very specific narrative sold to legitimize down the line increased use of force by the police state, which we've seen plenty of examples of again. So we have to sort of resist becoming cops ourselves when we're talking about how we can reduce the negative impact of policing in our own lives, in our communities. So many pitfalls to keep track of. But the basic idea is education is important to understand our context. But it can't end there, and we can't enforce a sort of academic rigidity. There is no instant gratification when it comes to justice. There needs to be room for growth. I want to pull in an example that's sort of unrelated, but I've been thinking about, I'm a musician, I'm an artist, whatever. I write, I express myself through medium of music, as well as, this kind of stuff. And, it's been a while since I've done poetry, but I used to do that. And I was thinking about this idea for a project. I've been sort of, in my head every now and again, adding notes to it for the past few years. And there was one thing in it that was like sort of a poem that I wrote when I was in the middle of this very specific emotional event. And then I was like, oh no, was it on an old hard drive? There's no way I remember what I wrote. And I'm like such a different place in my life and such a different place as a person that there's no way I could recreate. I'm completely removed from the person who wrote that thing. So if I lost it, then it's gone forever. Whether or not it's a good piece of art, to me, it's important to understand, my journey or whatever, especially, trying to tell a story about growth. And often for me, when I'm constructing like an album or something like that, there's a narrative underlining it. And I think, a narrative should have some sort of arc. So it's much easier to sort of catalog growth when you literally have the passage of time and the growth of a person, and the perspective shift, documented. So I was sort of disappointed when I found that out, but luckily it was on a different device, so I still have it. But I mean, I guess it's just sort of evidence of every individual's capacity for change, and the fact that people's hearts and minds are not going to shift overnight. There's people who are concerned with being the most woke person in the room. For me personally, I try to be as up on my thinking as possible, and I try to be very critical of the way I think about things and try to expand my perspective. And it can be sort of frustrating when you interact with people. You have to somehow relate that information, and you've sort of ingrained in yourself, because especially when it comes to like the social justice language, because if you take in the perspective and you interact with people from certain communities who are trying to reclaim a language for themselves and try to empower themselves within the context of an oppressive history, like people use like slurs or whatever, that's a very simple example, though it's not always that cut and dry. If you see someone like using a slur and you're like, oh, yikes, that's rough. It can be, it can be difficult to try to calmly educate someone or whatever about, why they should think about their language. But for the most part, people are going to come into their understanding on their own terms. And it usually has to relate to them in some way. Sometimes it's I think it's going to be more effective when they can relate it to someone, like someone, super easy example. Some person A is racist against someone from group B. Let's say a white person is like, I don't like Samoans or whatever. And then they meet a person who is of Samoan ancestry and they talk about the misunderstandings. And then that white person softens their views. I mean, that's like a lame example. We see that cataloged in various media, film and TV and stuff like that. But I mean, that's like a simple, understandable example. But it kind of, sometimes it works kind of like that. Maybe not exactly like that, but kind of like that. Where people come by their understandings in different ways. And, they're essentially the thesis of today is to stop being a cop, keep an eye out for the narcs, try and build some interpersonal like connections and understanding, is a very valuable use of your time. And again, like, not everyone's going to be on the same level in terms of the understanding of things, but if you have the time and you have the means to educate yourself, I don't really think you have an excuse not to. So when I say like, yeah, people come into understanding in their own ways and people are going to be coming at things with different levels of understanding and education, that's not necessarily an excuse to be like ignorant and stupid, right? But again, in terms of movements, there has to be room for people to grow. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere. And in terms of like trying to make sure we're doing the most right thing at the moment, and trying to, play cop against people who aren't doing what we think is the most right thing in the moment. What I've seen, like literally, like I've seen video of people screaming at other people in the streets in terms of protests, like people breaking windows. Yeah, you know what? There again, I guess it's kind of the same dynamic. There might be people out there who are bad faith actors who are trying to smash windows and stuff because they think that it's going to delegitimize the demonstrations of everyone else. But it's also true that if there's no smashed windows and no burning buildings, these conversations die out much quicker. So there is a sort of strategic calculation there. And yes, if it's your community, you might feel a certain attachment. And again, I can't make a value judgment on these things either way because I'm not directly, involved or affected. No one's trying to, smash my windows in or anything like that. And I haven't been killed by cops. I mean, I don't feel particularly comfortable around the police. But you know what I mean? Like there's just all these pitfalls and these tendencies that have plagued movements like this in the past. I think that is why history is important. Partially so we can understand the context, but also to see what worked and what hasn't. What has killed these movements before? A big part of it, like I mentioned, has been like the CIA and the FBI. So yeah, be wary of that. But like, we don't do ourselves favors by only fighting in the abstract and being at each other's throats for things where there is some flexibility and room for genuine change and growth. I don't know. I've seen a lot of discussions about this lately, and I think people are coming to a certain understanding with this thing that we call cancel culture. I mean, there's still a lot of back and forth, and I think there are people who sort of use their identity as an excuse you know, I mean, you know, speaking as someone Southeast Asian, I know there are people who, you know, say, well, Asians are technically people of color, so we have a certain say and a certain perspective, you know, that is legitimized by our identity. And that, you know, that's true in a certain degrees, but also, you know, there are certain ways in which, you know, your identity as not a white person is different than someone who's like black or something. But again, you know, we talk about this. I haven't talked about this, but you know, the conversation when it comes to Asian Americans is the sort of model minority myth, and how that's a fluid thing. You know, we saw with Corona, waves of anti-Asian violence because of the demonizing of, you know, Chinese and so on and so forth. But you know, that is one example, and how, you know, there are plenty of very conservative Asian people and people who understand the sort of language of social justice may weaponize their identities in order to legitimize their conservative views. But also, you know, there's a lot of like liberal centrist black people who are like, because I'm black, I can speak on these issues and just be, you know, a mouthpiece for capital, an apologist for, you know, for cops, because people protest, because maybe I agree with the protest, but they don't do it the way I want them to. Recognizing that, you know, the setbacks when it comes to, you know, the way we use identity. But again, you know, sometimes there are things that affect certain communities in a specific way that, you know, really only those people who are affected can weigh in on. But that doesn't necessarily speak against essentializing, because again, you know, this community in like Minneapolis or something like that, or some other community in America that may be majority black, may face certain issues that are sort of reflective of the black experience in America. But just because that's true doesn't mean if you're a black billionaire that those things affect you the same way. They can, but they generally won't, because poverty is a huge part of the equation. So I don't know. Basically things are very nuanced, which makes it difficult. But we have to have a nuanced understanding, which is why education and just living and the ability to grow is important. But stop trying to be cops. Stop trying to call in the deep state to solve your problems, because it's not gonna be great for you in the end. Be aware of the surveillance state. Be aware of being overly monitored. And yeah, be wary of fear being weaponized to turn you against your best interests. But I think that'll do it for this week. Hopefully I was able to synthesize everything that I've been thinking about. And I've been kind of peeking at my own streams, looking back at them, and trying to think about how I can present things better in a more palatable way, in a more coherent way. It's a little different when I'm just kind of doing things off the top and I don't have anyone to bounce ideas off of. Just the way it sounds when I'm sitting here in this room. But you know, I'll take feedback. Actually, no, I won't take feedback unless you know who I am. If you're a rando, keep your thoughts to yourself. No, not really. I don't know. You can say whatever you want. I don't really care. But yeah, continue on Thursday. I don't know. I kind of want to make Thursday's stream have something to do with 4th of July, some kind of theme. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know how I'm going to do it. But that was my idea. I don't know what it's going to be, but be here same time, same place. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to have to be away basically for a couple of weeks. I want to try to be able to stream though, but it'll probably be at a different time and it won't be this quality. Like I won't have my microphone with me. So I want to see about how I can do that. So I don't know, just that's a heads up. But anyway, thanks for tuning in again. Please stay safe. Please, 4th of July weekend, I'm planning on doing something, but like with just like me and my girlfriend and like maybe her roommates. But if you're going to be doing like a barbecue in your backyard and you're inviting your family and you're inviting the neighborhood over, like, don't fucking do that. Don't go to the beach. Be aware of the grocery stores and stuff like that. I'm sure they're going to get swamped this week, especially right before the weekend. If you're going to buy a bunch of beer, do it tomorrow morning or something, Don't wait till Friday. Wear a mask. Try not to be a cop. And try to have a good time as you can. But anyway, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Again, thanks for watching. See you next time.